at the Department of Health Services. I'm actually employed by UW-Madison, but I'm contracted to DHS. And so I'm sort of like the person.
I didn't really look into that stuff, but I probably shouldn't. I was going to look into it more, but then you had done some of that here. It's good.
What happened to this guy? He was talking to Jocelyn. He's not.
Oh,
Now he's
Scott, we
muted.
can't hear you.
Oh, Scott hit the mute button.
So I started taking one-to-one boxing classes now.
You did?
Well, what happened is the schedule
Please
rearranged
make
now,
sure
so I
everybody's
can-
muting
Please
yourself.
So I'm not someone else.
Scott, you're muted.
Okay.
There, I
better?
can hear you now. Yeah.
I have no idea how I got muted. I did not touch anything. So let me try to get back to where I was. Hopefully people can still see my screen.
Yep, I can still see it.
Okay, good. And I will try not to do that again. I don't know what I touched. So anyway, by way of introduction, this is new. I've never trained on Teams before. This is my first time. So this is good practice because DHS is going to Teams this summer. So I'm learning. And if you know by my picture, I'm not a young guy.
Is now joining.
No, it looks nice.
So by way of introduction, I come at this with personal and professional interest. Personally, I come from a family where there was a lot of trauma in my family, a lot of domestic violence. So I grew up witnessing a lot of stuff that was not good for me. And I really think as I look back that it really affected my health long term. I mean, at the age of 16, I had an ulcer and I had a widowmaker heart attack 5 years ago. And I was told by my doctor I shouldn't have survived it. And I also have a high ACE score. And as you'll know today, as we're going to talk about ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, people that have had a lot of adversity in their childhood, they tend to have health problems as they get older, both mental health and physical health problems. So that made sense to me. And professionally, I've been in the behavioral health field for well over 30 years. Actually closer to 40 years, and I worked as a therapist for the first part of my career, and I did not work as a therapist with a trauma-informed perspective because it was all way before we knew about this stuff. So I think back and I look back with some regret that the people I was supposed to help, I wasn't able to help them as well as I could have because I didn't know about trauma and trauma-informed care. So when I learned about all this well into my career, I'm thinking, oh, I wish I could have known about this, back in the 1980s. It would have transformed the way I help people. So the one thing about this work is what I'm trying to do is help put humanity back into human services because there's so many human service agencies out there around the state. They're trying to do good work, but they're doing it with an old paradigm, the old medical model, I guess you could call it, where people just come in and we're the experts and we tell them what they need to do. Being trauma informed is really understanding where people have come from, their experiences, and that they're wounded people, and a lot of us are wounded healers, so we need to have that understanding. So what I want to do today during our time, and we're going to take a break around 10 o'clock, just so everybody knows, we'll take a 10-minute break so people can kind of get up and take care of themselves because this is a lot to do, a lot to cover in just a couple hours. This is normally a half-day training, so I've pared it back to try to fit it into a 2-hour window. What we're going to do today is we're going to define some of the key words around trauma. What is trauma? Is it a bad thing that happens to people? What is it? So we'll talk about that, and of course we need to talk about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, because that laid the groundwork for all that we're talking about today. I have a video that I'll play that'll better describe that study than I could ever do. And then we're going to talk about what trauma-informed care is and how to identify those 6 principles, those 6 pillars of trauma-informed culture. Because ultimately what I love to see in my work is not just train people about what is trauma-informed care, but how do you begin to change your work environment, your work culture, so it's more trauma sensitive? And that's for everybody. It's not just for our clients or our consumers or those that come to us receiving services. It's for all of us. So if I'm a leader of an organization, I want to make sure that I'm practicing my leadership in a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive way with my staff, because they're coming to work with their stuff too. And if they're in a job that has a lot of stress and they're having to do a lot of heavy emotional labor, like in the behavioral health world, especially now with COVID, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can to make sure that my employees, my staff are healthy, feeling healthy, they're safe, and they're engaged in their work. Because sadly, that is not what's going on in our state right now. But what I'd like to just have you think about is just think about, let's look at this whole COVID-19 thing in a more positive light, if that's even possible. But I'd like to think about what is one gift from this time that you will keep and hold on to, because it's been very dark, it's been very challenging, it's been very isolative. I mean, in trauma, those who come from trauma, being isolated is not a good thing. And we'll talk more about that. But what is one gift from this time that you're going to keep and hold on to? And it may be just remind yourself of it. For me, it's been spending, I guess, more time with my wife and being able to be home. And she had a health emergency a few months ago, so I'm grateful I'm here for her to take care of her after her situation. So I've also really got good at being out in nature last year in the spring and summer, and did a lot of walking because my gym was closed. And being a heart attack survivor, I need to get in the gym and get my heart rate up. So I did a lot of walking. But just think about what is one thing that you could keep and hold on to going into this next year, and maybe you'll hang on to it for the rest of your life, because it's something that this pandemic has given you a chance to experience something for the first time that's healthy. And also want to remind everybody that we're going to be talking about some things today that are kind of heavy, and I want to make sure that all of you are taking care of yourselves. So I gave you some gentle reminders on this screen of what you can do to take care of you, because we're going to be talking about trauma, we're going to be talking about neglect and abuse kinds of things, because that's where all this comes from. So I want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So if you have to do some deep breathing, to give yourself some positive self-talk that you're safe. Count to 10, use fidgets, putting hand lotion on is good. Anything to help you and stay grounded in the here and now. Because I know when I did this training live, there was oftentimes people were taking me up on that, and they were leaving to get out to leave for a little bit, or they were doodling on a piece of paper. And I know I'm not the only trauma survivor in this conversation today, so please take care of yourself. But thing that we know that is so important, I'm going to say this over and over again this morning, is that we are relational beings. We need each other. And healing from trauma, therapy is good, therapy is necessary, but the research tends to indicate the most important factor in whether I'm going to heal properly from a past trauma injury is the quality of the relationships that I establish. And it only has to be with one person. That tends to be the biggest deciding factor. Whether you're a child or you're an adult or you're an elder, having that stable, caring relationship can mean everything. And so I'm going to be reminding all of us today that we need each other. And with all this isolation that we've been going through, it concerns me that people that are struggling out there, who were struggling before the pandemic, are really feeling this lack of connection with other people. And that's concerning. So we need each other. It's very, very important. So I want to play a video to start off today, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. This comes from Jamie Redford, who is Robert Redford, the actor Robert Redford's son. And Jamie was a pioneer. Unfortunately, he just lost his life late last year at the age of 56. But he was instrumental in the ACEs movement and trauma-informed care. He created two documentaries, one called Paper Tigers, which dealt with some kids in an alternative high school in Washington State who come from a lot of trauma, and how that school changed their culture to be trauma-informed and how it's impacted these kids' lives in a very positive way. And he did another one called Resilience, which talks about what are those factors that we need in our lives that will push back against the power of adversity in childhood. because it's a very powerful thing, as you're going to see from this video. So hopefully you can hear it. I hope I clicked the right button when I was sharing my screen, but I'm going to play this. It's about 4 minutes long, and then we'll go on from there.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
Okay, so that did a much better job of explaining the ACE study than I could ever do, but it's fascinating research. Interestingly, when Dr. Andan Felitti, let me move this next slide, when Dr. Andan Felitti released their publication, their research, a lot of their peers, the other physicians, thought it was junk science, that there was nothing there, that there was a lot of, I don't believe this is real. And unfortunately, there's still some people out there who still believe the ACE study doesn't have any merit or isn't valid. But this study has been replicated all over the country since 1998, all over the world. And the data that they get back is very consistent with what Dr. Zand and Flitti received in 1998. With this group in San Diego, California, that's mainly white, upper middle class, highly educated folks, which is not a representative sample of our country, right? So the data that they saw in San Diego was really astounding because they thought this was a very privileged group. But ACEs doesn't care about that because children are facing adversities all the time. So the research came back, and now we know that ACEs are common. When we bother to ask the questions, when we begin to shift the focus to that, to adversity in childhood and how that affects people, and we know that it's passed from one generation to the next. Both my parents used to tell stories of what they went through growing up. Both my grandfathers were they were tough customers. My paternal grandfather was an extremely violent man. He used to beat my grandma and my dad and his brothers all the time. And I heard the stories. And my parents, if they were still alive, they probably wouldn't identify that they were trauma survivors, that they just had a rough upbringing. They just had a strict upbringing, and that wasn't anything out of the ordinary during that time, because that kind of behavior was sort of normalized back then. But now the research is showing, yeah, but look at what the impact it's having on the brains of these kids that grow into adulthood and become elders in our society. Maybe we've never even looked at or asked those questions, but it might explain a lot of what we see in people's behavior. If we were to go back and ask those questions about what happened to you, instead of looking at somebody's behavior and wondering what's wrong with this person, what's their story? So that's why it's really important to look back at this study and really think about, if this is true, and if this data is real, then maybe we as a society need to be spending more of our time moving further upstream and finding those families and those kiddos and help get them services that they need so that they don't grow up to be adults or elders in our society with a lot of problems, a lot of mental health and a lot of physical problems that could be directly related to their experiences. But the good news is that if you had a lot of adversity in your childhood, it's not a destiny. It doesn't mean that if you have an ACE score of 6, you're going to die 20 years sooner, because there are resiliency factors in our life, those things that are good, that are helping us. One of the handouts I left for all of you that you'll be getting, or you maybe already have, is a modified ACE study questionnaire, because Dr. Zana and Flitti, they had the first 10 questions of the questionnaire that I gave all of you. But if you'll notice, if you're observant, you'll see there's 14 questions, because what we have learned since that original ACE study is that adversity in childhood happens not just at home. For me, I went to school in fight flight all the time, fight, flight, or freeze, because my brain was in a different place because of the family I grew up in. A child who's coming to school in a heightened state of arousal, who's really upset and anxious and scared, they're not going to learn. And I ended up having to repeat 3rd grade because my grades were so bad. And that was a trauma in and of itself, because all my friends moved on to 4th grade. And when I stayed in the 3rd grade, of course, then they all started calling me dumb and stupid. And oh, by the way, that's what my dad always called me too. So it must be true. So that is a trauma too, right? That's an adversity, but it didn't happen at home. So we need to count these adversities outside of the home, because all of it kind of creates this person and the way they look at the world. We'll talk more about that. We're also beginning to expand our understanding of ACEs beyond just what happens at home, those first 18 years of life, because there's also adverse community experiences that are going on in kids' lives that are affecting them as well, just as significantly, whether it's poverty, discrimination, violence, lack of opportunity. Maybe they don't have a permanent place to live. all those things make up the whole ACE picture. And we need to be looking at the whole child, the whole person's life when we're looking at ACEs. We've been gathering our own data in the state of Wisconsin since 2011. This is data that we captured between 2015 and 2018. But what we know is that 59% of Wisconsin residents have reported having at least one ACE. And if you remember the video, the original ACE study was over 60%, like 64%. So we're a little bit beneath that. But again, this is data that we've collected in the state over the last several years, 10 years or so. And not surprisingly, people of color tend to have the highest percentage of any ACE, whereas whites and Asians have the lowest percentage of any ACE. Again, that's not surprising. And hopefully we'll continue to gather more data around these groups of people to figure out, how can we move upstream? How can we begin to shift resources to these populations so that these people aren't growing up and then becoming consumers of our systems, whether they're incarcerated or they're in treatment centers or whatever. We need to be thinking about ways to get these people with the help that they need. ACEs don't care about income either, although you'll see on this slide, if you make less than $25,000 a year, your percentage of having 4 or more ACEs goes up. That makes sense. But again, the original ACE study, most of those people were pretty well off, and the ACE scores were really, really eye-opening. So it's not, ACEs doesn't care about how much money you make. But ACEs does affect mental health, and this, again, you see this relationship of ACEs along the bottom axis of 0 to 4 or more, and the percentage of having anxiety, frequent mental distress, or lifetime depression, the percentages go up as the ACEs go up. And we've seen this consistently with every state and even in different countries. There's this dose-response relationship is the fancy word for it. So the more ACEs you have, the more chance of having a particular health issue. And again, we look at asthma, fair to poor general health, or obesity, that same relationship exists. And for me, I was very obese at the time of my heart attack 5 years ago, and I've had to change my life drastically since then, obviously, if I want to keep living. But I look back, I have an ACE score of 5, so I'm right in the middle. And that definitely plays a part in my overall health. I thought I was fairly healthy besides being really overweight, but clearly I wasn't. In Wisconsin, the number one form of abuse is emotional abuse. And that's pretty consistent with the national data. Then there's also physical abuse and sexual abuse. And I don't want to minimize those two because the percentages are smaller. Those are people's lives. And it's shocking, but these forms of abuse leave a very, very powerful imprint on that person's brain and physiology. And as we're going to learn as we go through this, that it begins to explain a lot of things. Smoking. Why would smoking be on here? Well, nicotine is a really good regulator. If I'm in fight, flight, or freeze because of all the stress or the toxic stress I'm experiencing, let's say I'm a pre-adolescent. Maybe I'm 10, 11, 12 years old, and somebody introduces cigarettes to me. Not only do I think it looks pretty cool, but I smoke and I kind of chill out because nicotine is a powerful drug, a very addictive drug, but it's also a good regulator. It brings you back down to baseline. So that's a powerful reinforcer. If I'm somebody who comes from a lot of trauma and I start smoking at a young age, it chills me out a little bit. That goes into my toolbox of my coping skills that I'm going to carry with me. Now, it has its own set of problems, right? Its own set of health issues. But as you'll find, people who come from trauma and a lot of adversity, their toolbox for getting through life is made up of things like cigarettes, like alcohol, like drugs, like violent relationships, cutting on yourself, you name it. That goes into the box of coping skills because that's all I have. Nobody's ever taught me how to get through life other than to do these things. So it's not surprising we see smoking. The percentage of people who smoke in Wisconsin is double what the general population is, I think because of trauma. So what is trauma? We've been talking about this. I've been mentioning trauma-informed care. At its purest form, the word trauma in Greek means wound. It's a wound. And we know that people have physical wounds and they have psychological wounds. But most people, when they hear the word trauma, they immediately go to physical wounds because that's what we can identify with. We can see if somebody's injured. We can see the broken limb, or we can see whatever's going on, the bandages, whatever. And we know that what's necessary for that wound to heal properly is time and the right care, right? Psychological wounding is just as significant. The thing is, we can't always see it. We might see the behavior from that trauma, or we'll see some cluster behaviors, and what we're likely to do is label that behavior good, bad, or this person's good or bad, or they're screwed up or whatever, but we don't understand them because we never have taken the time to understand that psychological wounding is just as prevalent, is just as real as a physical wound. And what needs to happen for that psychological wound to heal is time and the right care. And that is where we're falling short in our human service delivery system, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country. Because oftentimes people are rushed into treatment, into programs, and then we throw them in all these groups. If they have some type of substance use disorder, let's take that. We throw them into all these groups, the black box of treatment, and then we hope that they go through all these experiences and come out the other side sober and starting some form of recovery. Well, our systems aren't set up that way. Even looking at going to the doctor, I see my doctor for 15 minutes. Ideally, I think even physicians would say they wish they could spend more time with their patients. That would be trauma informed because they want to get to know their patients. They want to get to know them on a level where they can really be a partner in helping their patients come up with healthy ways of going through life. But our system's not set up that way. It's all about billable hours. It's all about revenue, for profit or even profit. There's all this concern about we need the funding streams, it's all been set up to be non-trauma informed, and we need to be thinking about that because we're not doing anyone any good by rushing them because they just keep coming back to the system over and over again, and we keep doing the same things thinking we're going to get a different outcome. So trauma is a real thing, and really when we talk about trauma, it's more about the reaction than the event. What I mean is that we could all experience the same traumatic event right now. And we are through COVID, obviously, but we could have like an acute traumatic event right now that we all experience. We would have very different reactions to that trauma. It's very subjective. And that's the key because we can't assume that what's traumatic for me is going to be traumatic for you and vice versa. Dr. Judith Herman calls trauma the disease of disconnection because people who come from a lot of trauma, they don't really know how to be in healthy relationships with other human beings because the people that were supposed to teach them to do that oftentimes weren't able to do it themselves. So if you got mom and dad at war all the time, or if you even have a mom and dad, but if you have your caretakers are not in a good place themselves, if they have a high ACE score and they're just trying to get through life, you're going to pick up on that. You're going to learn. And what we learn is we become very disconnected from people. I could never tell somebody my story because they would hate me. I feel so much shame for what happened to me as a child that I can't possibly tell anybody because they'll never understand. So I keep that story locked in and I just go through life, shuffling through life, making really poor decisions because I don't know any other way. That's all I know. We know that trauma lives in the body. I've heard a lot of stories of people that have taken up yoga, for instance, and when they're doing these yoga poses, they begin to weep uncontrollably, and it scares them. And I've talked to yoga instructors who have been in my training, and they'll come up to me at break and say, "I've seen that," and I never knew what to say to my client or to my student because I didn't know why they were crying, but they've seen it more than once. That's because trauma lives in the body, in the cells, in your system, in your muscles. And when you're doing these poses, these yoga poses, you're releasing some of that toxicity and it comes out in really strong emotions. And I've heard the same thing with people that have taken up acupuncture or even deep tissue massage because you're really manipulating the body in ways that haven't been done before and that trauma needs to get out in some way. I talked about the relationship piece. Again, if I grew up in a family where my mom and dad were at war with each other, or there was a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, a lot of anger, it's going to affect how I get into relationships with people down the road because they were my teachers. So it shouldn't surprise any of us if I get into chaotic relationships as an adult. And I keep recreating that trauma story because nobody's ever explained to me the connection between my past and my present, but we're on trauma. And more importantly, nobody's ever taught me how to get through life, how to cope with life, other than what's in my little toolbox of stuff that's not good for me or anybody else. So until somebody teaches me and teaches me the realities of what all this is, and how to cope differently, this is what I'm going to do. And there is a trauma worldview we're going to talk more about where you question your place in the world. So why are so many people talking about trauma? 120 of you came today to have this conversation. What is it about that? What's going on that we're finally talking about trauma and people's adversity? Well, I think that there's a lot of people out there that are finally telling their stories. There's disclosure. We're trying to break that stigma of silence where I don't want to feel like I'm going to be rejected if I share my story. No, there's a lot of brave people that are telling their stories. And it's very empowering because two of my heroes come from very, very chaotic families, backgrounds, childhoods, and I don't even know how they survived. One of them is a woman. Her name is Tony or Kane, and she lived on the streets for 19 years. She ate out of dumpsters. She lost 4 kids to the system. She lived in Annapolis, Maryland. She still lives there. Arrested over 80 times, in and out of treatment 66 times, treatment or corrections. Until in 2004, she finally got into a trauma-informed program, and it completely changed and saved her life and the life of her children. It's an amazing story. They did a documentary on her life as well. If you want me to spell her name, I can. It's Tonier, last name Cain, Cain. And you can put it into the internet. You can see mugshots from all of her past experiences and then see what she looks like now. You can't believe it's the same person, but I've been fortunate enough to meet her and talk to her a little bit, and she's one of my heroes. My other hero is a Dane County Circuit Court Judge, Everett Mitchell. And his story, too, his childhood is just horrendous. But he ended up going to college, goes to law school, becomes a lawyer, becomes a judge, and he's also the leader of his church. He's a reverend, so he's a pastor of his church. Met him, and I've had a chance to present with him. And he's an amazing, amazing guy. And they're both two of my biggest heroes. But because people like that are telling their story and sharing it, we're understanding that trauma is very, very prevalent out there. It's like the hush hush word that we don't want to talk about. I mean, I've had counselors, therapists my age in my training come up to me and say, I'm terrified of talking to my clients about trauma because I don't want to open that can of worms. But that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to help people open those cans of worms and kind of do some digging in the dirt kind of a thing. So it's really important we understand that this is very prevalent. The science, ACEs science is real. That really kind of started this whole process going. But also we understand now that trauma can be passed from one generation to the next through the genetics, epigenetics. We know that trauma affects the way the brain is wired. I'm going to show you the brain of a child later that has been abused. You're going to see how different that brain is from a brain of a healthy, well-adjusted child. So the science is there. We now know that trauma is not just a bad thing that happens to people, that it profoundly can change the way our brains are wired and put together, and because of that, how we look at the world and walk through it. Services are being developed now that are taking the trauma piece, and we're looking at it. As a therapist, I can tell you, I never asked any of my clients about trauma. I never did because it wasn't part of my psychosocial assessment I was supposed to talk about. And sadly, even today in 2021, therapists are still not going there, air quotes, and talking about trauma. But thankfully, there are programs that have been developed to take the trauma into account, and they're starting at that point. Let's talk about your trauma. Had I done that as a therapist, my goodness, my practice would have been transformed because I would have been so much more effective as a helper because I was missing a big piece of my client's story. Because the research would indicate that over 90% of the people who walked through my door had a significant trauma history that maybe they never recognized, or I certainly didn't ask about. And then we talk about hope, how other possibilities emerge. And I love to tell the story about Father Gregory Boyle, who looks like Santa. He's kind of like a Santa, I guess. He's got a big heart. Father Boyle lives in Los Angeles. His parish sits at a place where there's a lot of gang activity. A lot of young men and women are killing each other on the streets. And back in the 1980s, Father Boyle was spending a lot of his time officiating funerals of these young men and women who were killing themselves only because they belonged to the wrong gang. And he began to understand something very profound. He understood that these violent gangs spring out of what he calls a lethal absence of hope. Just think about that. How do you walk through life having a lethal absence of hope? So he correctly put his finger on the issue, and so he created Homeboy Industries, which is an Homeboy bakery, and he has a tattoo removal service. But what he does is he brings these young men and women in off the streets. He loves them unconditionally. He gives them a work skill, and he teaches them about being in relationship with others, with himself and with each other. These young men standing with Father Boyle in this picture are probably from rival gangs. And in another time and place, they would have been trying to kill each other. But here they stand in a family portrait, and they all learn to love each other. He wrote a book called Tattoos on the Heart, the story of boundless compassion. And you can go out on the internet and find some of his TED Talks and some of his keynotes he's done at conferences. But he's an amazing guy. But he's not a therapist. He's a priest. But he understood that what heals trauma is relationships. And he gives these young men and women hope. And they're now getting married. They're having families. He's helped them break the cycle. Again, they have this tattoo removal service where they're getting rid of all these tattoos that a lot of them wear. But let's even back up further. Why are these young men and women getting in gangs in the first place? Well, you heard me say at the beginning that we're relational beings. They're looking for a family because their family that they came from is probably non-existent or highly broken. If there's a dad, that would be amazing, but the dad may be in prison, dad may be dead, mom may be around, or maybe she's not around. My friend Tony Kane, who I talked about earlier, her mom was an alcoholic, and she'd bring home guys and get drunk in the living room. Then when mom would pass out, the men would come down the hallway because they knew she had 9 kids. And you know what they were going to do? So Tony, being the oldest, she'd stand in the hallway and block these men from getting at her brothers and sisters, but it made her available. And that's what led her down the road of what I mentioned before, 19 years on the streets. What happened to you? What's your story? Tonier has a story. These men in this picture have a story. And Father Boyle has taken the time to get to know them as people, to love them, and they're responding. There's many different phases of trauma. I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but I want to talk about this because trauma, not all traumas are the same. And so we want to talk about the different phases of trauma. The first one is acute trauma. And this would be a trauma that happens mainly to adults, not always, but mainly adults. It's usually a single event that hits you out of left field. You weren't ready for it. You weren't prepared for it. It really challenges your ability to cope. But it tends to happen to adults that have pretty good childhood development. So they tend to bounce back fairly quickly because at the end of the day, we are very resilient beings. Human beings are very, very resilient innately. So that's the good news. That's acute trauma. So this trauma is a one-time event. It has a beginning, middle, and end, and mainly happens to adults, and they can bounce back from that fairly quickly, given the right care at the right time. Now, complex trauma is something different. What I just explained to you about Tony Kane, that's an example of complex trauma because it happens early onset. Tony was 9 when she was first abused sexually by these men, but it can be even younger than that, or vulnerable adults. So what happens is this early onset, these are people that are powerless. They're in a very powerless position, and they're not single events. They're multiple events that go on over time. So it feels like it'll never end. And they're very, very invasive and very interpersonal. And you can imagine what I'm talking about. And the most damaging part of it all is there's this shame attached to it. Because oftentimes these children or these vulnerable adults are told, you're the reason why this bad thing's happening to you. It's your fault. And so oftentimes these young ones, they accept that as truth. So they put on this cloak of shame that says I'm worthless. And they walk through life that way. They may put that cloak on at the age of 4. And they wear it through their whole life, which is tragic. And those people that wear this cloak of shame that says I'm worthless, they're not going to make good decisions for themselves. And can we blame them? I certainly can't. So we have to be willing to meet them where they're at and give them some skills and some knowledge that around what we're talking about today. Historical trauma is a trauma that happens usually to a group of people. And by that, I'm talking about African Americans, Native Americans, Holocaust survivors, but it's collective, cumulative, emotional, psychological trauma that goes across generations. So I've been fortunate enough to train some of the tribes in the last several years, and they always want to talk about this historical trauma because they all have a story. They have grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, mom, dad, who were in the boarding schools, and what happened to them in the boarding schools. and you see the tears and you can feel the pain. And you see the young people on the reservation still who are really, really in a bad place. They're making bad decisions because, again, that trauma was never healed. That goes back maybe 70, 80 years. So it can create this sense of survivor guilt, low self-esteem, depression, anger. We see it a lot in the young people as well. Then there's sanctuary trauma, which is a trauma that happens in a place where you should feel safe. Your home, or receiving medical services or mental health services or foster care, schools, places of worship. You should feel safe in those places, right? Because the people in there, they care about you and you should feel like you're going to be taken care of. But when you're wounded and you're abused in these places of sanctuary, what are your chances you're going to grow up to feel safe with anyone or trust anyone? Not likely. You're not going to feel safe anywhere. That's why safety is one of the most important principles in trauma-informed care, is creating physical and emotional safety, because a lot of trauma survivors have been violated in their place of safety and they don't trust anybody. You really have to earn their trust. And it's not because you're untrustworthy, it's because that's a protection for them. Vicarious trauma is a trauma that happens like a lot of people that work with other human beings. First responders, right now the healthcare workers with the COVID-19, therapists. Whenever we're experiencing or exposed to other people's trauma and misfortune over and over and over again, that can wear you down. And if you're not careful and if you don't have a good self-care plan, you can begin to show post-traumatic stress symptoms just like the people that you're working with. And this is probably the number one reason why a lot of people burn out and they leave the profession, whether it's first responders or, healthcare, whatever. They leave the profession because they have nothing left to give. And that's very powerful. That's why it's so important for us in a trauma-informed culture to make sure that we're giving people permission to self-care, to take care of each other, and not having unreasonable expectations for some of the people that we work with. Ann Jennings talks about this a lot. She says that, we get pretty good at the trauma paradigm when we think about clients and recovery. We think about the people that we're serving. We're focused on their trauma, but we oftentimes don't think about what happens to the workers, doing that heavy emotional labor. Because like she said here, that she's seen some pretty traumatic things and some of those things still haunt her 20 years later. And I'll talk a little bit more about moral injury in a little bit, because that's really important with what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19. But vicarious trauma is something we need to be aware of, know that it's there, and have a plan to address it, because we want our staff to stay in the game and keep providing services. You want to see talented people leave the profession because they're working in a place that didn't recognize that even existed. I added collective trauma last year because of COVID-19, because I'm thinking, with everything that's going on, there's got to be a name for what we're dealing with, what we're going through. And it's called collective trauma. And this type of trauma is multi-layered. There's many, many layers to it. And it negatively impacts entire societies or groups of people. Well, in our case, it's affected the entire world, right? The entire world has been affected by COVID-19. You can't get any broader than that. And there's two main components to this type of trauma. One of them is the inability to escape. When is this going to end? Last year, like in April, I'm thinking, well, by July, I'll be back at work again, and I'll be back on the road doing my training. Here I am, still sitting here at home doing my training. So this feeling that we can't escape it. And then this other piece is that we can't make sense of it. It's like, unless you're really old, you remember the pandemic from 1919, we've never been through this before. This is new. So I still sometimes get struck with this feeling of unreality if I do go out, and I see everybody wearing a mask. And it's like, what happened? What is this? Well, it's collective trauma. Because this type of trauma, it elicits this, it violates our familiar ideas and expectations about the world, right? I can identify with that. I thought the world operated a certain way and we all got along a certain way and my life was going to look a certain way, but then COVID-19 happened and all that changed. I have two grandchildren born last summer. I've hardly seen either one of them. It's sad that I don't have a relationship with them yet, and they're 8 months old now. They just turned 8 months old. I get the pictures, but I have this like stabbing feeling of, oh, I wish I could see them. So this affects us, and it puts us in this state of extreme confusion and uncertainty, right? I think we can all identify with that. This affects everybody. And some examples of collective trauma I listed on the screen: war, mass violence, genocide, and pandemics. Well, we've had 2 of those 4 in the last year, and some of it's still going on with the mass violence and the pandemic. So you'll have to excuse us if we're having a hard time coping with this, because there's a lot that we're having to cope with. And oh, by the way, then we also have our past traumas that we're dealing with, or maybe we're dealing with current traumas, losses, which I'll get to in a minute. So I don't know if we have the chat feature to do this at all, but this is, I'm not sure how it works with Teams, but maybe I'll just ask this question kind of generically, and you don't have to respond unless you want to, but how is collective trauma showing up in your place of work if you're still working? You know, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? For me, I hear my coworkers on Zoom calls, and I think there's a lot of Zoom fatigue. I think we're all anxious to get back to life again and see each other and have those relationships resume, not just as an image on a screen. So I'm kind of feeling a little bit tired, feeling stressed out sometimes about that, and just really needing to connect with my family, and more than I am. But we're just trying to find other ways to do that. So just something to think about. I want to talk a little bit about moral injury, because this may be a term you've never heard before. But basically, there's a lot of this going on right now, particularly with healthcare workers and with first responders, because moral injury is damage that's done to our conscience, our moral compass. It's whenever we have to perpetrate, witness, or fail to prevent acts that affect our own moral beliefs. What that means is like a nurse who feels powerless watching a patient who's has been intubated on a respirator. She's in PPE, he's in PPE, their humanity has been taken away. This person can't see their family. This person is dying of advanced COVID-19, and the doctors and nurses feel powerless. That would be an example of moral injury. People going off to war. Just a regular person who's been a law-abiding citizen, here's a gun, there's the enemy, you shoot them. That's a moral injury because you're taking the life of another human being. That's going to leave a mark. It's very significant, very significant. So again, it just happens when we engage, fail, prevent, or witness acts that conflict with our values. This is a quote from a doctor in New York from last April, Dr. Lorna Breen. She was an ER doctor in New York City at the height of the COVID in New York, when it was just hell on earth. And she told her sister that I couldn't help anyone. I couldn't do anything. I just wanted to help people, and I couldn't do anything. And sadly, this physician took her life end of April last year. This is a woman of faith. She had a faith. So she had a strong faith at one point, but her faith was shaken to the point where she had to take her own life. That's what happened. That's what can happen in moral injury. It's a very different type of trauma that we're dealing with. So again, it comes from a variety of places. You know, making these difficult life and death decisions, not having enough resources, which we heard a lot about last year, witnessing something they perceive to be unfair, feeling guilty about their impact on what their jobs, how that's affected their family. So some of the symptoms of moral injury would be, again, loss of faith, like with Dr. Breen, depression, loss of meaning in your life, guilt, which says I made a mistake, versus shame, I am a mistake, and then self-sabotage. Substance use disorders, anxiety, isolating, not good, feeling of despair, suicide, and intrusive memories. So it's going to take a long time for us to come out of the mental health wreckage from COVID-19. It's going to be significant. There's going to be a lot of post-traumatic stress. There's going to be a lot of moral injury stuff going on. And unfortunately, our mental health resources are stretched thin as it is right now, because so many people are reaching out for help to connect in some way. Looking at the trauma data, at least half of the adults in the United States have had a traumatic incident. Now, this is way before COVID. This is 2006. So right now, we could probably say all of us have experienced one incident that's been traumatizing, that being COVID. And 90% of people that seek behavioral health services have been exposed to multiple exposures to trauma. And again, I never knew that on my own because I never screened and assessed for it. But what we do know is that trauma affects our brains. So a person experiences a traumatic incident. Their brain, there's a smoke detector in your brain called your amygdala, and that's about the biggest word you're going to hear me say today, maybe. There may be one other one, but I don't like using those big words because I don't understand half of it myself. But your amygdala is the smoke alarm in your brain. So that's always looking for danger. When it perceives something that's dangerous, it alerts the body. The alarms go off. So the body becomes overwhelmed with these very powerful drugs. You go into, it's called fight, flight, or freeze. Your body goes through like 1,400 different changes very quickly. Your heart pounds, adrenaline's flowing, cortisol's flowing through your system. You're ready to fight this threat, run from it, or hunker down. And if that trauma goes untreated, let's say you're a child and you're constantly going through fight, flight, or freeze at home, you get stuck in this stress response mode where your brain is beginning to get wired. What fires together wires together. So if those threat neurons in your brain are constantly being used, that part of the brain gets really, really overdeveloped. And then the brain gets actually rewired into looking for threats and danger all the time. It's never really settled. So they get stuck in that stress response mode, and then they continue to get triggered by things that remind them of the original trauma, whether it's a loud noise, a smell, a texture, a date on a calendar, whatever. And that person continues to live in this state of perpetual fear. They've added one more trauma response called fawn. So we've got fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And this kind of gives you an idea of what people may exhibit when they're in this state a lot. If you're in flight, you're a workaholic, overthinker, obsessive compulsive disorder, difficulty sitting still. A fighter, you have angry outbursts, controlling, the bully, narcissistic. Freezing, you can see what that looks like. Difficulty making decisions, you get stuck. Dissociating means you kind of check out, got that 1,000-yard stare. Numbing out. And fawners, those are people that they're people pleasers. They don't have much of an identity. There's no boundaries. They get overwhelmed really easy, become codependent. But those are examples of what trauma can look like in a person. Looking at the brain on the left here is of a normal, healthy brain of a child. And you'll see that there's a lot of red and yellow, which is good. That means that that's really heavy, high brain activity. So this is a child that's been in a very loving, safe, nurturing, consistent environment. And the brain is wired accordingly. The brain on the right is an abused brain, and this is the brain of a Romanian orphan. And if you know anything about those children that are orphans in Romania, traditionally, they're institutionalized, so they're put in these large rooms with other children, but there's not a lot of human adult interaction. What we would call, Peter Levine calls it serve and return. Because that's what wires our brains to be healthy and active, is when kids are being talked to and respond by cooing at them and laughing at them and making faces and just interacting and having fun with them. That's what that little brain needs. It's exploding in its neurodevelopment, because the brain's exploding in its development until about the age of 5. But look how dark this brain is compared to the one on the left. Look how dark it is. The only part of the brain that's lit up is down here on the bottom. That's where the amygdala is. That's the smoke detector. So this is a brain that's been wired to look for danger. It's different from the brain on the left. That's a psychological trauma. That's the trauma that we're looking at, the wounding of this brain. And if this child was in one of our schools, we might see a child that has a difficult time forming attachments, or they are explosive violently. They can't control themselves, anger outbursts. And a school not being trauma informed, they're going to look at that behavior and do what a lot of us do when we don't understand the big picture. We just look at the behavior and we judge it and we label it, and then we act accordingly. A lot of non-trauma informed schools would look at a child that's continually acting up in classroom and say, well, we have our policies and procedures, we document, and we have IEPs, and we have all of our rules, and we get that. They're not even thinking about the fact that they may be looking at a child with a brain that looks like this. All the healthy brain neurons have been whittled away, because remember what I said, what fires together wires together. So this child's been exposed to a lot of danger, perceived danger. So the brain has just really worked on those parts of the brain that deal with the danger down the bottom, but it's pruned away or cut away the neurons that would normally be seen in a healthy, active child. So you can, so this, there's a real, there's a there, that's what I'm saying. Another way to explain this very simply is the triune brain. And lately I've been noticing in the research that people are starting to wonder and question the triune brain. I don't understand that because I think it's a real simple way to explain the brain to people. You can use Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, if you can see on here. But basically the reptilian brain is the first part of the brain that gets developed in utero. And that's the part of the brain that deals with instinct and survival, your breathing, your heart rate, stuff like that. That's the most primitive part of the brain. And then we go to the limbic system, which is the emotional brain. So that's where our emotions sit. And then we have the neocortex, the blue part, which folds over the top of the limbic system. That's the last part of the brain that gets developed in utero. But that's what distinguishes us from every other animal on Earth, because that's where our speech, our logic, and higher thinking skills come from. So what happens to a brain when it's exposed to danger? Well, Dan Siegel would say that we would flip our lid, which means the neocortex goes offline. And who's driving the bus then? The brain bus? It's the reptilian brain and the limbic brain. They're in charge. I'll give you an example. Have you ever tried to talk to somebody who's in fight, flight, or freeze, who's really upset, angry, upset, outraged, and you're trying to have a normal, rational conversation with them? How did that work? Doesn't work, right? It doesn't work at all, because that part of the brain it's by design, actually, because the way we've been developed is if we perceive a threat, we don't need the higher thinking skills at that point. We just need to get our butt either out of trouble or fight it or do something. But we don't appreciate the beauty of a tiger while we're running from it. So that's why the neocortex goes offline. But a lot of people, a lot of kids are going to school with their lids flipped, where their neocortex is offline because of what just happened at home. And they haven't figured out how to self-soothe and how to get their neocortex back online. And there are ways you can do that through deep breathing, grounding techniques, helps bring people back online. But we don't often do that because we don't understand any of this. So it's really important to understand that the trauma lives and it gets stuck in a person's limbic brain. And we need to help them. The first thing we can do with anybody who has a traumatized brain is to teach them how to self-soothe, how to get themselves back to baseline without reaching for the drugs, the cigarette, the whatever it is, alcohol, finding healthier ways to just get themselves grounded. There's another fancy word. This is the only one you can hear from me. It's called the allostatic load, but that just basically means that trauma just doesn't affect the brain. It affects every organ system in our bodies. And that's called the allostatic load, which just means that if you're constantly in stress mode, you can have a lot of these problems. And I can identify, remember, I had an ulcer at 16, stomach, and I had a heart attack at the age of 56, 5 years ago. So you can see there's two organ systems right there that could be affected by this. So trauma does have a very profound impact on our overall health and well-being. I'm going to talk just a little bit about elder-specific traumatic experiences, then we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we'll finish up. So let's talk about the elder-specific traumatic experiences, because this group of folks, they have very specific trauma experiences that we need to understand and put it in context, maybe where they've been earlier in their life. Elders experience loss of spouse and peers more than others, chronic life-threatening diagnoses, physiological changes, limitations and disabilities that they didn't have previous. If you had, somebody who was had a very vigorous, active life, and they've had some type of whether it be a stroke or something else, that is a huge traumatic incident that grieving needs to happen. Cognitive memory loss, the loss of roles and resources. We, especially in our society, we're so tied into what do you do for a living? What our work really defines who we are. And if we don't have that anymore, a lot of times people go into retirement not really understanding what is this going to look like and who am I and what is my purpose. And then increased dependence. So you take those losses that are very specific oftentimes to the elder population, and then ask the next question, how does having a trauma history compound these later in life traumas? Have we ever thought of that? Have we ever made that connection before? Probably not. I think a lot of elders would even identify that they had a traumatic background. Like my parents, they would have said, nah, I wasn't abused. And I heard the stories, Mom and Dad, you were abused. And they both died before their time of smoking related issues because they started smoking at a very young age because of trauma. But just think about how having a trauma history that maybe has been undisclosed up to this point, maybe affecting them now, dealing with all these new traumas. Something to think about. So it's 10:01. What I'd like to do, if that's okay, is I'd like to take a 10-minute break, come back at, it's 10:01 on my clock. We'll come back at 10:11 and we will continue. So everybody take a break, take a deep breath, and we will resume in exactly 10 minutes. Thanks.
I'm also going to stop the recording for this first part, and then when Scott starts up again, I will do the second part as well.